March 28, 1942, 1:34 a.m. Lieutenant Commander Stephen Holden. Beatty stood on the bridge of HMS Campbelltown, watching the largest dry dock in the world grow closer through the darkness. In approximately 90 seconds, he would drive his destroyer, packed with 4.5-ton high explosives, directly into the massive steel caisson gates at 20 knots. The collision would likely kill him. Even if it didn't, the 5,000 German troops garrisoning St. Nazaire would almost certainly finish the job. Behind him, crammed into every available space on his ship, 268 Commandos waited to storm ashore into what British planners privately called a one-way ticket. 16 other vessels followed in his wake, carrying another 353 raiders. Their mission? Destroy the only dry dock on the Atlantic coast capable of servicing the Tirpitz, Germany's most powerful battleship and the greatest threat to Allied shipping lanes. The odds of success? Military analysts gave them 1 in 10. The odds of survival? Significantly worse. Beatty had already passed the point of no return. German searchlights suddenly blazed to life, turning night into day. Within seconds, every gun in the harbor would open fire. He had 2 choices, both catastrophic: ram the dock and hope the explosives detonated on time, or turn back and watch the Tirpitz hunt convoys unopposed across the Atlantic, potentially severing Britain's lifeline to America and losing the war. He pushed the throttle forward. This is the story of Operation Chariot, the most audacious commando raid of World War II. It combined the desperate courage of a suicide mission with the precision of a jeweler's work, executed by ordinary men who volunteered for almost certain death. Military historians rank it among the greatest raids in history, yet somehow it has faded from popular memory, overshadowed by D-Day, overshadowed by Market Garden, overshadowed by operations that involved more men and more famous names. By the end of this story, you'll understand why this matters more than just another daring raid. You'll see how 600 men, in a single night of controlled chaos, changed the strategic balance of the entire Atlantic War. You'll understand why the Germans never saw it coming, why it should have failed in a dozen different ways, and why, against all logic and probability, it worked. But we can't just jump straight to that explosive collision. Without understanding the context, without grasping the impossible strategic puzzle the British faced in early 1942, the raid makes no sense. Why would anyone volunteer for what amounted to elaborate suicide? Why would planners send men on a mission they privately believed would end in annihilation? Why did this one dry dock matter so much that Churchill himself authorized the operation? To understand that, we need to go back to May 1941, when the greatest naval hunt in history ended in the cold waters of the Atlantic, and British planners realized they faced a power nightmare that kept getting worse. May 27, 1941. The battleship Bismarck, pride of the German Kriegsmarine, slipped beneath the waves after a brutal 3-day hunt involving virtually the entire British home fleet. For the Royal Navy, it was triumph. For British strategic planners, it was merely the end of round 1. Because waiting in Norwegian fjords, being fitted out and prepared for Atlantic operations, was Bismarck's sister ship, Tirpitz. And Tirpitz was, in several ways, even more dangerous. Let me explain why this mattered, because the numbers tell a story of existential threat. Britain in 1942 was an island nation fighting a global war, dependent entirely on merchant convoys crossing the Atlantic. Every week, hundreds of cargo ships made the perilous journey from North America and Canada, carrying food, fuel, weapons, aircraft, ammunition, everything needed to keep Britain in the war. Lose control of the Atlantic, and Britain would be starved into submission within months. Churchill himself wrote, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. But U-boats, deadly as they were, attacked individually or in small wolf packs. A battleship was different. A battleship could break into the convoy lanes and create absolute carnage. Consider what Bismarck accomplished in her brief 8-day operational career. On May 24th, she encountered the British battlecruiser HMS Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy, the largest warship in the world, the symbol of British naval supremacy. Bismarck destroyed her in 4 minutes. One salvo penetrated Hood's ammunition magazine. The explosion broke the massive ship in half. Of 1,418 men aboard, 3 survived. 4 minutes, 1,415 dead. One of the most powerful warships ever built, reduced to wreckage. Tirpitz was bigger, newer, and mounted 8 15-inch guns that could sink any merchant ship with a single hit and seriously damage any warship afloat. Her maximum speed of 31 knots meant she could outrun anything she couldn't outfight. Her armor, up to 12.6 inches thick on her belt, 8 inches on her deck, made her nearly invulnerable to anything except concentrated battleship fire or aerial torpedoes in perfect conditions. But here's what terrified British planners most. They couldn't afford to fight her. Think about what this meant strategically. Every time intelligence reported Tirpitz preparing for operations, the Admiralty had to assume she was breaking out into the Atlantic. Every convoy would need battleship escort, pulling capital ships from the Mediterranean, from the Pacific, from every other theater. The home fleet would have to maintain constant readiness, burning fuel, wearing out machinery, exhausting crews, and if she actually broke out, if Tirpitz reached the convoy lane, war gaming exercises at the Admiralty produced nightmarish scenarios. A single Atlantic sortie by Tirpitz could sink between 30 and 50 merchant ships before the Royal Navy could intercept her, if they could intercept her. That represented over 300,000 tons of shipping, enough to cripple Britain's supply chain for months. The escorts protecting those convoys, destroyers, cruisers, maybe even a battleship, would likely be destroyed trying to slow her down. The British had learned this lesson with Bismarck. Hunting her required 2 battleships, a battlecruiser, 2 aircraft carriers, 13 cruisers, and 21 destroyers. The operation consumed massive fuel stocks and pulled naval assets from around the world. And Bismarck was only operational for 8 days, never made it to the convoy lanes, and still took the combined might of the Royal Navy 3 days to sink. Tirpitz was better protected, more experienced crews, and the Germans had learned from Bismarck's mistakes. But there was one critical factor that made Tirpitz even more dangerous than her sister ship. One element that transformed her from a major threat into a potentially war-winning weapon. Bismarck had sortied from Germany, where she could use multiple ports for supply, repair, and refuge. Tirpitz was based in Norway, over 1,000 miles from German shipyards. If she was damaged in combat, even minor damage that didn't sink her, she would need extensive repairs before returning to operations. And in early 1942, there was only one facility on the entire Atlantic coast that could handle a ship of Tirpitz's size and draft, the Normandy dock at Saint-Nazaire, France. The Normandy dock was a monster. Built in the 1930s to service the great French ocean liners Normandie and Île-de-France, it measured 1,148 feet long and could accommodate ships up to 85,000 tons. Its massive caisson gates, each weighing 1,300 tons, were the largest movable steel structures in Europe. The dock was deep enough, wide enough, and equipped with the specialized pumps and machinery needed to lift a 50,000-ton battleship out of the water for hull repairs. It was the only dock between the Arctic and the Mediterranean that could service Tirpitz. More importantly, it was only 5 miles from the open Atlantic and the convoy routes. If Tirpitz was damaged in a convoy raid, she could limp to Saint-Nazaire, undergo repairs in relative safety, and sortie again within weeks. The dock transformed Tirpitz from a weapon that needed to be handled with extreme care into one that could take risks, absorb damage, and return to the fight. British planners ran the numbers. With Saint-Nazaire available, Tirpitz could potentially conduct 4 to 6 Atlantic sorties per year. Without it, she would be far more cautious, unwilling to risk damage that would require a 200-mile journey back to Germany through waters dominated by the Royal Navy. The conclusion was inescapable: destroy the Normandy dock, and you effectively caged Tirpitz in Norway. She would become a fleet in being, a threat that tied down British resources but couldn't actually operate with the same freedom. Spare the dock, and you faced the realistic possibility of losing the Battle of the Atlantic. And that's exactly what terrified everyone in Whitehall in the winter of 1941-1942, because Tirpitz was almost ready. Intelligence reports indicated she would be fully operational by late February or early March 1942. The window to act was closing. The problem was simple to state, impossible to solve. How do you destroy a dry dock located 5 miles up a heavily defended estuary, surrounded by 5,000 German troops, protected by shore batteries, anti-aircraft guns, patrol boats, and arguably the most sophisticated coastal defense system Germany had built anywhere in occupied Europe? The RAF had tried. On November 7, 1941, 37 bombers attacked St. Nazaire. They dropped 91 tons of bombs. The result? Minor damage to dockside facilities, zero damage to the Normandy dock itself. The caisson gates were built to withstand the pressure of holding back 9 million cubic feet of water. They could absorb incredible punishment. A second raid on November 18th achieved similarly negligible results. The Admiralty calculated that it would take sustained bombing raids, hundreds of sorties, to have any chance of seriously damaging the dock. The RAF couldn't spare the aircraft. Every bomber sent to St. Nazaire was a bomber not attacking German cities, not supporting the campaign in North Africa, not defending Britain itself. A naval bombardment was considered and rejected. The Loire estuary was shallow, winding, and easily mined. German shore batteries could engage any British warship long before it got within range of the dock. The risk of losing capital ships was unacceptable. Submarine attack? The massive caisson gates were protected by anti-submarine nets, and the approaches were too shallow for conventional submarines. Even if you got a submarine through, a standard torpedo wouldn't inflict enough damage. By December 1941, British planners were running out of options. Tirpitz would be operational in weeks. The Normandy dock remained intact. And then, in a small office in Combined Operations Headquarters, someone suggested an idea so audacious, so improbable, and so desperate that it could only have emerged from the peculiar strategic desperation of Britain in early 1942. What if you loaded a destroyer with explosives and rammed it into the dock gates? There was one man in the British military establishment who didn't think the idea was insane. In fact, he thought it was brilliant. Captain Robert Ryder, Royal Navy, had spent the previous 3 years learning that impossible missions were actually just difficult ones that required creativity, courage, and a willingness to ignore conventional wisdom. At 34 years old, he had already lived several lifetimes worth of adventure. His men called him Red for his ruddy complexion. His superiors called him unconventional. His enemies, and he had made several within the Royal Navy's conservative hierarchy, called him reckless. What made Ryder different was simple. He had been trained to think like a pirate instead of an admiral. Born in 1908 to a naval family, Ryder entered the Royal Navy in 1927 as a cadet at Dartmouth. His early career followed the standard pattern: junior officer assignments, navigation training, steady progression through the ranks. Nothing suggested he would become the man who planned and executed the most audacious raid of the war. Then came the Antarctic. In 1934, Ryder volunteered for the British Graham Land expedition, a scientific survey of the Antarctic Peninsula. For 2 years, he commanded the expedition's ship, Panola, navigating pack ice, uncharted waters, and conditions that would have destroyed most vessels. He learned to improvise with limited resources, to calculate risks that didn't appear in any manual, to keep a ship operational under conditions the Admiralty could never have imagined. More importantly, he learned that conventional thinking could kill you In the Antarctic, you survived by ignoring what the textbooks said was impossible and focusing on what you could actually do with the resources at hand. If the chart said a passage was blocked, you found another way. If the equipment wasn't designed for the conditions, you modified it. If the mission seemed impossible, you broke it into smaller possible pieces. When Ryder returned to regular naval service in 1936, his superiors didn't quite know what to do with him. He had proven capabilities, but he asked uncomfortable questions. Why did we always do it this way? What if we tried something else? Had anyone actually tested that assumption? The Royal Navy in peacetime had limited patience for such questions. Ryder's career stalled. He was assigned to anti-submarine warfare training, important work but not the path to flag rank. He might have remained there, a competent but unconventional officer teaching sonar techniques, except that in September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and everything changed. The war transformed Ryder's unconventional thinking from a liability into an asset. In October 1940, he was given command of HMS Prince Philippe, part of a makeshift force evacuating British soldiers from French ports after the fall of France. The orders were standard: rescue as many men as possible while avoiding unnecessary risk to the ships. Ryder looked at those orders and saw their limitation. Avoiding unnecessary risk was subjective. To him, losing ships was unfortunate. Leaving soldiers to be captured or killed was unacceptable. Over 6 trips to the French coast, Prince Philippe rescued over 2,000 Ardees. Ryder repeatedly took his ship into ports that other commanders deemed too dangerous, navigated through waters other captains wouldn't risk, and improvised solutions to problems that had no precedent. On one trip, he wedged his ship alongside a quay that was supposedly too damaged to use, loaded 400 men in 23 minutes, and departed while under fire from advancing German units. His superiors noticed. More importantly, a new organization noticed. Combined Operations Headquarters had been established in July 1940 with a mandate that would have seemed insane in peacetime. Develop ways to take the offensive against Germany through raids, sabotage, and unconventional warfare. While the British Army rebuilt after Dunkirk and the Royal Navy fought the Battle of the Atlantic, Combined Ops was tasked with hitting back, doing damage disproportionate to the forces committed, keeping the Germans off balance, learning lessons that would be essential for the eventual invasion of Europe. They needed officers who could think creatively, who weren't bound by peacetime regulations and conventional doctrine, who could look at an impossible mission and figure out how to make it merely suicidal. Robert Ryder was exactly what they needed. In late 1940, he was assigned to Combined Operations and began working on small-scale raids against the Norwegian coast. These were pinprick attacks, landing small parties to gather intelligence, destroy installations, capture prisoners. They rarely involved more than 100 men and usually lasted only a few hours. But they taught Ryder essential lessons. He learned how to approach a hostile coast without being detected. He learned how special forces operated, the Commandos who would become Britain's elite raiding force. He learned how to coordinate between naval vessels and ground troops, between the precision timing required at sea and the chaos of combat ashore. Most importantly, he learned that the enemy's strongest fortifications usually had weaknesses, and those weaknesses were often psychological. German defenders in Norway expected attacks to follow conventional patterns. They expected the British to be cautious, to minimize casualties, to withdraw if resistance was too strong. Ryder learned that if you did the opposite, if you were aggressive where caution was expected, if you pressed forward when conventional wisdom said to pull back, if you accepted casualties that other commanders would avoid, you could often succeed through sheer audacity. The Germans couldn't believe anyone would be that reckless, which meant they didn't prepare for it. By December 1941, Ryder had conducted 8 raids against the Norwegian coast. Several succeeded brilliantly. 2 failed when intelligence proved inaccurate. 1 nearly ended in disaster when German patrol boats appeared unexpectedly, and Ryder had to make a navigation through a minefield at night without charts. a feat that earned him a Distinguished Service Order and a reputation as either very skilled or very lucky, depending on who you asked. His own assessment was more prosaic. We were neither particularly skilled nor particularly lucky. We were simply willing to try things that seemed impossible, and occasionally they worked. That attitude brought him to the attention of Lord Louis Mountbatten, who had been appointed Chief of Combined Operations in October 1941. Mountbatten was looking for officers to plan and execute increasingly ambitious raids. When the idea of attacking St. Nazaire came across his desk, proposed by a junior planner who was probably joking, Mountbatten didn't dismiss it. He called Ryder into his office. "I have a question for you," Mountbatten said. "Hypothetically, if you needed to destroy a dry dock in occupied France, and the dock is 5 miles up a defended estuary, and bombing hasn't worked, and you can't use a submarine, what would you do?" Ryder thought for perhaps 30 seconds. "Ram it with a destroyer packed with explosives," he said. "Old destroyer, American if possible, since we can spare them from Lend-Lease. Pack the bow with delayed action charges. Ram the dock gates at high tide and maximum speed. The ship will be stuck in the gates. The charges detonate after the crew evacuates. The explosion destroys both the gates and the destroyer, which will then sink and block the dock entrance. Even if they repair the gates, they can't use the dock because the wreckage will be in the way." Mountbatten stared at him. "I asked hypothetically. I answered practically. You realize this is suicide? It's suicide if you think about it as a conventional naval operation. But if you think of it as a commando raid that happens to use a destroyer instead of a landing craft, it's merely very dangerous. Commandos volunteer for dangerous missions. Get volunteers, go at night, achieve surprise if possible, ram the dock, fight ashore long enough for the charges to arm themselves, then extract whoever's left. And what are the odds of success?" Ryder didn't hesitate. "Against the mission, probably 50-50 if we can achieve tactical surprise. Against survival, much worse. But you didn't ask me about survival. You asked about destroying the dock." Mountbatten was silent for a long moment. Then he pulled out a folder and slid it across the desk. "Start planning. You have 6 weeks. Absolute secrecy. Codename, Operation Chariot." By early January 1942, Ryder had concluded that raiding St. Nazaire was not only possible but necessary. The strategic logic was undeniable. The tactical challenge was to make the impossible merely improbable, and the improbable barely possible. He would need help. Ryder's first move was to recruit someone who understood how to blow things up on a scale that would make sabotage experts nervous. He found that person in Lieutenant Colonel Charles Newman, commander of No. 2 Commando. Newman was 38 years old, a building contractor in civilian life, and possibly the least military-looking soldier in the British Army. He was short, rotund, and looked more like someone's cheerful uncle than an elite commando leader. His men adored him. His superiors weren't quite sure what to make of him. The Germans, on the night of March 28th, would learn that appearances were catastrophically deceiving. Where Ryder provided naval expertise and strategic vision, Newman brought tactical genius and an intimate understanding of what commandos could and couldn't do in combat. When Ryder explained the mission, Newman's first reaction was to laugh. His second was to start planning. "How many men can you give me?" Newman asked. "The destroyer can carry about 270 troops if we pack them in. I can provide motor launches for another 350 or so. Call it 600 total, including the crews. Against 5,000 Germans? Against whatever portion of those 5,000 we encounter in the 6 hours we'll be ashore." Newman pulled out a map of St. Nazaire. The Normandy dock dominated the northern section of the harbor. Around it, gun positions, searchlights, guard posts, barracks, fuel storage tanks, U-boat pens. It was the most heavily defended square mile of the French coast. "Let me think about this," Newman said. He thought for 3 days. The problem was mathematical. Not the mathematics of equations and calculations, but the mathematics of limitations and possibilities. You could frame it as a simple question with no simple answer. How do you keep 600 men alive long enough to accomplish their objectives when they're outnumbered 8-1 in enemy territory, with no possibility of reinforcement? Newman's answer was elegant. You don't try to keep them alive. You try to keep them effective. The distinction was crucial. A conventional military operation prioritizes force preservation. You attack with superior numbers, maintain reserves, have extraction plans that prioritize minimizing casualties. Newman couldn't do any of that. He would have the men he started with, no reinforcements, and extraction would depend on factors outside his control. So instead of planning for survival, he planned for effectiveness. Each commando team would have a specific objective. Destroy this gun position, demolish that pump house, blow up those gates. The teams would be self-contained, with their own explosives, their own weapons, their own orders. If one team was wiped out, the others would continue. If communications failed, and they would fail, each team knew its job and would do it independently. This was revolutionary tactical thinking for 1942. Modern special operations routinely employ this kind of decentralized command, but in 1942, military operations were still largely centralized. Commanders commanded, troops executed. You didn't give junior officers and NCOs independent authority to make mission-critical decisions. Newman's plan did exactly that. He divided his force into assault groups, protection groups, and demolition groups. Assault groups would land first and secure the immediate area. Protection groups would establish defensive perimeters. Demolition groups would destroy the primary objectives. Each group had clear priorities, but also discretion to improvise if circumstances changed. If the plan survives contact with the enemy, Newman told his officers, we've made a mistake in planning. The plan is the starting point. Your judgment is what matters. By late January, the outline was taking shape. Ryder would command the naval force, HMS Campbelltown, the explosive-laden destroyer, plus motor launches carrying the bulk of the Commandos. Newman would command the military force, 268 men on Campbelltown, another 353 on the motor launches, organized into 18 demolition teams, 3 assault groups, and 4 protection groups. The target list was ambitious to the point of fantasy. 1. The Normandy dock caisson gates, primary objective. 2. The outer Moleold entrance, secondary objective. 3. 4 winding houses, controls for the dock gates. 4. The pumping station, essential for dock operations. 5. 3 U-boat basin bridges. 6. Lock gates for the old entrance. 7. 2 gun emplacements on the Mole. 8. Various harbor installations. Most commanders would have considered even one of these targets a worthy objective for a full-scale raid. Newman was planning to hit them all simultaneously with a force smaller than a single infantry battalion. But here's where the brilliance emerged. Each demolition team carried exactly the right amount of explosives for their specific target, pre-positioned and ready to place. No time wasted on calculations during the raid, no decisions about where to place charges. Every man knew his job down to the precise placement of each explosive. The demolition teams practiced on mock-ups built in secret training areas in Scotland and Wales. They practiced placing charges in darkness, under simulated fire, in time-pressure scenarios where they had minutes or seconds to work. They practiced until they could do it blindfolded, until the muscle memory was so ingrained that stress and combat wouldn't degrade their performance. Newman established a benchmark. Every demolition team had to be able to place their charges and arm them within 10 minutes of reaching their objective. Anything longer risked being caught before the job was done. Most teams got it down to 5 minutes. The Commandos themselves were volunteers drawn from combined operations forces. They were told only that they were training for a very special, very dangerous operation. They weren't told the target, the date, or the mission specifics until they were already at sea, committed to the operation. What kind of men volunteered for something like that? Mostly ordinary ones. The popular image of Commandos is of superhuman warriors, but the reality in 1942 was more prosaic. These were clerks and factory workers and shopkeepers who had joined the army and then volunteered for more intensive training because regular army service bored them, or because they wanted to feel like they were actually fighting the Germans, or sometimes just because commando training included better food and more leave. Some were motivated by revenge. Many had lost family in the Blitz or had seen their hometowns bombed. Some were simply young men who wanted adventure before bureaucracy and routine ground them down. A surprising number were motivated by nothing more complex than peer pressure. Their mates volunteered, so they did too. Newman's insight was that you didn't need supermen. You needed trained men with clear objectives who understood that their individual survival was secondary to mission success. That sounded grim, but it was actually liberating. If you weren't trying to survive, if you accepted that you probably wouldn't, then fear became less paralyzing. You could focus on the job. This wasn't suicidal fatalism. Newman made it clear that everyone should try to survive, that extraction was planned, that they were expected to fight their way back to the boats. But he also didn't lie to them about the odds. "Some of you won't make it back," he told them during a briefing in early March. "That's the reality. If that's unacceptable, speak to me privately and you'll be reassigned without prejudice. But if you come on this raid, I need you focused on the mission, not on getting home. Do your job. Do it well, and we'll get as many of you out as possible." Not a single man requested reassignment. By late February, the plan was complete. Mountbatten presented it to the chiefs of staff. The First Sea Lord, Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, was skeptical. "You're asking me to approve what amounts to sacrificing a destroyer and 600 men for what might be a temporary inconvenience to the Germans." "Not an inconvenience, sir," Mountbatten replied. "A strategic necessity. Tirpitz is operational. Every day she remains viable extends the Battle of the Atlantic and increases our losses. Destroy St. Nazaire, and she's effectively neutralized for the Atlantic campaign. And if it fails? Then we've lost a destroyer we can spare and commandos who volunteered knowing the risks. If it succeeds, we've removed the single greatest threat to the convoy system." Pound studied the plan for a long moment. "When can you execute?" "Late March. We need a specific tide window, high spring tide to get Campbelltown over the mud banks, combined with moonless night for concealment. The window opens March 27th. And the men know this is likely one way. The officers know. The men will be briefed during the approach." Pound signed the authorization. "God help them," he said quietly. Churchill, when informed, was more enthusiastic. "A proper raid," he called it. "This is how you take the offensive." He added a handwritten note to the operational orders. "All good wishes and good fortune. Give them hell." The final piece of the puzzle was the ship. They needed an old destroyer, expendable but still seaworthy, that could be modified to carry the explosives and the commandos. The Admiralty provided USS Buchanan, a World War I-era destroyer transferred from the U.S. Navy under Lend-Lease. She was old, worn, and scheduled for scrap. Perfect. Buchanan was renamed HMS Campbelltown after a British destroyer sunk earlier in the war. Naval engineers went to work. They removed 2 of her 4 funnels, reshaped the remaining, 2 to resemble German torpedo boats, and reduced her profile to help with the disguise. They lightened her by removing most of her weapons. She wouldn't need them for more than a few minutes. They reinforced her bow to withstand the impact with the caisson gates. And they installed the explosives. 4.5 tons of amatol, high explosive, packed into steel containers and welded into compartments in the ship's bow. The charges were placed as far forward as possible, below the waterline, encased in concrete to direct the blast forward and downward into the dock gates. Delayed action fuses would give the crew time to evacuate before the explosion. The fuses were set for 8 hours after activation. This was controversial. Why not 2 hours or 4? The answer was psychological warfare. 8 hours meant the ship would be crawling with German engineers, officers, and dock workers trying to assess the damage and determine if the ship could be salvaged. When those 4.5 tons detonated, the casualties would be catastrophic and the psychological impact would be enormous. Some historians have criticized this as unnecessarily cruel. Others point out that the men on that dock would be trying to repair facilities that would help kill Allied sailors, and that psychological warfare was a legitimate tactic. The debate continues. By March 25th, everything was ready. Campbelltown was loaded and disguised. The Commandos were staged at Falmouth. The motor launches were fueled and armed. Weather forecasts showed acceptable conditions. Intelligence reported normal German activity at Saint-Nazaire. No indication of heightened alert. The point of no return approached. Ryder assembled his officers for a final briefing. "Gentlemen," he said, "we are going to run up the Loire River, ram the dock gates, blow up everything we can reach, and fight our way back out. The enemy has superior numbers, superior firepower, and home field advantage. We have surprise, training, and audacity. Those will have to be enough." He paused, looking at each man. "I won't lie to you. Some of us won't make it back. But if we succeed, if we destroy that dock, we will save thousands of merchant sailors' lives. We will cage the Tirpitz. We will prove that nowhere in Hitler's fortress Europe is safe from British raiders. That's worth the risk." Newman addressed the Commandos separately. His message was simpler. Do your jobs. Watch out for each other. Make it count. On March 26th, the force departed Falmouth. 16 motor launches, 1 motor gunboat, 1 destroyer, 6 to 11 men. The weather was clear, seas moderate. As they steamed south toward the French coast, Ryder finally revealed the target to the men. The reaction was mixed. Some men were shocked at the audacity of it. Others were quietly calculating their odds of survival. A few laughed, the kind of nervous laughter that comes from realizing you volunteered for something truly insane. But not one asked to turn back. They sailed through March 26th and into March 27th, maintaining radio silence, watching the skies for German reconnaissance aircraft. The plan called for crossing the French coast after dark on March 27th, timing the approach to arrive at Saint-Nazaire at 1:30 a.m. on March 28th, the exact time of high tide when the water would be deep enough for Campbelltown to get over the mud banks and reach the dock gates. Everything depended on timing. Arrive too early, and they'd run aground. Too late, and the tide would be dropping, potentially stranding them. The margin for error was measured in minutes. As darkness fell on March 27th, the force formed up for the final approach. Campbelltown in front, motor launches in 2 columns behind her. Speed 12 knots, later increasing to 20 for the final run. Distance to target 60 miles, then 50, then 40. Ahead, invisible in the darkness, Saint-Nazaire waited. 5,000 German troops, dozens of gun positions, searchlights, patrol boats. The most sophisticated coastal defense system the Germans had built. Against them, 611 men, 1 destroyer packed with explosives, and a plan that depended on everything going exactly right for at least 15 minutes. The time had come. At 11 p.m. on March 27th, the German garrison at Saint-Nazaire was at normal peacetime alert status. This didn't mean relaxed. The Germans took coastal defense seriously, but it meant regular watches, standard patrols, the kind of routine that settles in after months of quiet nights. Harbor Defense Officer Kapitän zur See, Karl Konrad Mecker, was in his quarters, reviewing paperwork. His domain included 28 major gun positions, 43 light anti-aircraft batteries, and enough firepower to annihilate any attacking force foolish enough to approach the harbor. British bombers occasionally showed up, but they rarely did significant damage. The French resistance occasionally committed minor sabotage, quickly suppressed. The Americans hadn't yet entered the war in force. St. Nazaire had been attacked exactly twice in 6 months, both times by RAF bombers that achieved negligible results. The submarine pens, massive concrete structures that housed U-boats between patrols, were essentially indestructible. The dry docks were similarly robust. Mecca had quietly concluded that his posting, while important, was unlikely to see significant action. At 11:30 p.m., that assessment began to change. Coastal radar stations picked up what appeared to be a small convoy 60 miles offshore, heading south. Not unusual, the shipping lanes passed near that area. But the contacts weren't following normal convoy routes, and they appeared to be approaching the coast rather than paralleling it. Mecca was notified at 11:45 p.m. He ordered an increase in alert status and sent a patrol boat to investigate. The boat departed at midnight, heading west toward the radar contacts. At 12:30 a.m., approximately 30 miles offshore, HMS Campbelltown and her escorts made a crucial course change. They had been sailing with German naval ensigns, flying, a legitimate ruse de guerre under international law as long as you lowered the false flag before opening fire. A German-speaking officer aboard Campbelltown, Lieutenant Dunstan Curtis, stood ready with a signal lamp to respond to any challenges in perfect German. This was the first layer of the deception, make the Germans think they were seeing their own forces. The second layer was Campbelltown's modified profile. With 2 funnels instead of 4, and those funnels reshaped, she resembled a German torpedo boat, a Mover-class vessel. In darkness, at distance, the resemblance was good enough to create confusion. At 12:45 a.m., the German patrol boat made visual contact with the approaching convoy. The boat signaled, "What ship? State destination." Curtis responded in German. "Damaged vessels proceeding to port for repairs. Request permission to enter harbor." The patrol boat, uncertain, radioed back to headquarters for instructions. Mecca, now fully alert, ordered the harbor defense forces to action stations while they verified the ship's identity. At 1 o'clock a.m., Campbelltown was 15 miles from St. Nazaire, traveling at 14 knots. Behind her, the motor launches maintained formation, though several were struggling with mechanical problems. The launches were essentially wooden speedboats, reliable for short distances but increasingly unreliable over long distances in open water. 2 had already turned back with engine failure. At 1:15 a.m., the force entered the Loire estuary. The river mouth here was 3 miles wide, shallow in places, with shifting mud banks that could ground unwary vessels. Ryder relied on French charts provided by intelligence and a Royal Navy pilot, Lieutenant Green, who had studied the estuary obsessively for 2 weeks. Ahead, the skyline of St. Nazaire became visible, a dark mass against the slightly lighter sky, punctuated by occasional lights. No searchlights yet, no obvious alarm. At 1:20 a.m., they passed the first outer defenses. German positions on the riverbanks could see them now. But in darkness, seeing isn't the same as identifying. The ships were visible as shapes, not as threats. At 1:22 a.m., a German signal station on the southern bank challenged them with a bright signal lamp. Curtis responded, "2 craft of 3rd Minesweeper Flotilla, forced to return due to damage from British MTB attack. Request immediate entry." The response came back. "Wait, verifying with Harbor Master." Precious seconds ticked away. The tide was at its peak. In minutes, it would begin dropping. Campbelltown needed to hit those dock gates while the water was high enough to carry her over the mudbank that protected the harbor entrance. At 1:24 a.m., the harbor defense commander made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Unable to verify the ship's identity but seeing what appeared to be German vessels in obvious distress, he gave provisional permission to enter the harbor while continuing to try to confirm their identity through naval headquarters. The searchlights remained dark. The guns stayed silent. At 1:26 a.m., Ryder made his move. He ordered British naval ensigns raised and speed increased to 20 knots. Campbelltown's engines roared to full power. The motor launches accelerated, their wake phosphorescent in the dark water. The subterfuge was over. Now came the gauntlet. At 1:27 a.m., the first searchlight blazed to life. Then another. Within seconds, a dozen searchlights converged on Campbelltown, turning night into brilliant day. The destroyer was clearly visible now. British ensigns streaming, bow waves surging, heading directly for the harbor at maximum speed. At 1:28 a.m., the Germans opened fire. What happened next compressed hours of combat into 18 minutes of controlled chaos. To understand it, you need to visualize the geography. The Loire estuary at St. Nazaire formed a rough C shape. The Normandy dock was at the top of the sea on the northern side. To reach it, Campbelltown had to run a 3-mile gauntlet past gun positions on both banks, then turn north into the harbor itself. Those 3 miles were a killing zone. The first shells came from 75mm guns on the southern shore. Relatively light weapons that could fire rapidly but needed multiple hits to seriously damage a destroyer. They hit the water around Campbelltown, sending up geysers of spray. One shell struck her port side, punching through thin plating but failing to penetrate anything vital. Then the heavier guns joined in. 6 170mm coastal defense guns, powerful enough to sink a destroyer with a single well-placed hit. They fired more slowly, but far more accurately. The first 170mm shell missed Campbelltown's bow by 15 feet. The second struck her aft deck house, exploding among the Commandos sheltering there. Sergeant Thomas Durant was manning a Lewis gun on Campbelltown's deck when the shell hit. The explosion killed 3 men instantly and wounded 5 others. Durant himself was hit by shrapnel in both legs and his left arm. He stayed at his gun, returning fire at searchlight positions on shore. This would set the pattern for the next 15 minutes. The Commandos on Campbelltown's deck, exposed and vulnerable, maintained continuous fire against German positions even as casualties mounted. They weren't trying to win a gun duel. That was impossible. They were trying to suppress the searchlights and distract the German gunners long enough for Campbelltown to reach her target. At 1:30 a.m., Campbelltown was 2 miles from the Normandy dock. Beatty, on the bridge, could see the massive structure clearly now, illuminated by searchlights and burning flares. He could also see what appeared to be every gun in St. Nazaire firing at his ship. The noise was beyond description, the crack of outgoing fire from Campbelltown's remaining guns, the roar of incoming shells, the screaming of shrapnel, the deeper boom of large-caliber hits. Shouts of wounded men, the constant ringing of metal striking metal. The motor launches behind Campbelltown entered the killing zone. They had even less protection than the destroyer. Wooden hulls, no armor, top speed of 20 knots that still left them exposed for agonizing minutes. The German gunners switched some of their fire to these tempting targets. Motor launch 192, carrying demolition teams for the Old Mole, took a direct hit from a 75mm shell. The shell penetrated the engine room and exploded. The launch erupted in flame and stopped dead in the water. Survivors jumped overboard, some of them on fire. Only 3 men from the launch's crew and Commandos would survive. Motor launch 457 was hit seconds later. She didn't explode but lost power and began drifting back down the estuary out of the fight before it really began. ML 307 took multiple hits but remained operational, her skipper using every ounce of speed to get through the fire zone. At 1:32 a.m., Campbelltown was 1 mile out. Beatty could see individual details now. The massive steel caisson gates of the Normandy dock, the concrete walls of the submarine pens, the muzzle flashes from German positions. He could also see that the ship had taken at least 40 hits. The forward deck was a shambles. Casualties were mounting, but the engines still worked, the steering still responded, and the bow, packed with 4.5 tons of high explosive, was still intact. Newman moved among the Commandos crouched on deck. 2 minutes, he shouted over the din. When we hit, go fast and don't stop. Your teams know their objectives. At 1:33 a.m., a German 40mm anti-aircraft gun found its mark. A sustained burst raked Campbelltown's bridge. Beatty was knocked down by a shell fragment that gouged a furrow across his face. Lieutenant Commander Sam Beatty, no relation to Stephen Beatty, the ship's navigator, was killed instantly. 2 ratings were wounded. Beatty pulled himself up, blood streaming from his face wound, and checked the compass. Still on course. Speed holding at 20 knots. Distance, half a mile. The German gunners were firing at point-blank range now. A 170mm shell hit Campbelltown amidships, punching completely through and exiting the other side without exploding, a stroke of incredible luck, as a detonation would have broken the ship's back. 2 more 75mm shells hit the forward deck, killing 4 commandos and wounding 6 others. At 1:34 a.m., distance 400 yards, the Germans realized what was about to happen. You could see it in how the fire intensified, a desperate, concentrated effort to stop the destroyer before impact. Every gun that could bear opened fire. The water around Campbelltown became a sheet of spray from near misses. Hits rang against her hull like hammers on an anvil. At 1:34 a.m. and 30 seconds, distance 200 yards, Campbelltown's remaining forward gun fired its last shells. Not at the dock. At the German gun positions flanking it, trying to suppress fire for just a few more seconds. At 1:34 a.m. and 45 seconds, distance 100 yards, Beatty made his final course correction. Dead center on the caisson gates. Full speed. The ship was vibrating from the strain, rivets popping. Somewhere below a fire was burning, but the engines held. At 1:34 a.m. and 58 seconds, distance 20 yards, Beatty rang for emergency speed. The engine screamed. 21 knots. 22. At 1:35 a.m., HMS Campbelltown, displacing 1,090 tons and traveling at approximately 22 knots, struck the Normandy dock caisson gates. The collision was cataclysmic. The bow crumpled, exactly as designed, absorbing impact while protecting the explosives behind it. The ship's momentum drove her 36 feet onto the gate, the reinforced bow crushing the lower third of the massive steel structure. Campbelltown rode up and onto the gate like a ship running aground, then stopped, wedged firmly in place. The impact threw every man aboard forward. Commandos not holding on to something were hurled into bulkheads and equipment. Below decks, men were knocked unconscious. On deck, several commandos were thrown overboard. Then, for one incredible moment, there was silence. The ship had stopped. The German guns, perhaps shocked by what they'd just witnessed, momentarily ceased fire. In that strange pause, you could hear water draining from Campbelltown's damaged hull, the hiss of steam from ruptured pipes, and someone on the dockside shouting in German. The moment lasted perhaps 5 seconds, then Newman's voice rang out. "Go! Go, go!" The commandos erupted from Campbelltown like a human flood. They had trained for this moment for 6 weeks. They had practiced the disembarkation on mock-ups. They had memorized every step, every movement. But no training can truly prepare you for combat, for the disorientation of being under fire, for scrambling across a tilted, damaged ship while German machine guns try to cut you down. They went anyway. Down gangways, across the bow, jumping the gap between ship and dock. Assault teams first, establishing immediate perimeter security. Then demolition teams, laden with explosives, moving toward their objectives at a run. Protection teams behind them, setting up defensive positions to cover the demolition work. The Germans recovered from their shock and opened fire again. But now the commandos were dispersed, spreading out across the dockyard, using buildings and equipment for cover. The massed fire that had devastated them on Campbelltown's deck was less effective against scattered infantry. At 1:37 a.m., 2 minutes after Campbelltown rammed the dock, the first motor launches reached the harbor. They were supposed to land commandos at specific locations around the harbor to hit secondary objectives. The problem was that supposed to rarely survives contact with reality. The motor launches faced a nightmare. To reach their landing points, they had to navigate through the same fire that had savaged them during the approach. But now they had to slow down, maneuver, and attempt to dock, all while German gunners had perfect targets. ML-457, already damaged, attempted to land troops at the Old Mole. As she slowed to approach, a 40mm gun caught her with a sustained burst. The wooden hull splintered, the fuel tanks ignited, the launch became an inferno. Of 28 men aboard, only 5 survived, pulled from the water by other launches. ML-268 successfully landed her troops at the old entrance, but as she pulled away, a 170mm shell struck her engine room. The explosion was catastrophic. The launch disintegrated, killing everyone aboard. ML-160 approached her landing point, took heavy fire, and the skipper made a split-second decision. Attempting to land would guarantee destruction. He kept moving, searching for an alternate landing site. He would spend the next 4 hours trying to extract survivors. This chaos played out across the harbor. Some launchers got their troops ashore. Some were destroyed in the attempt. Some, their skippers making rational calculations about survivability, couldn't land at all. The carefully planned assault was fracturing into improvised survival, but at the Normandy dock, the primary objective, everything was working. At 1:40 a.m., 5 minutes after impact, Major Bill Copeland led his demolition teams across the dock complex. His primary objective, the southern winding house, which controlled the mechanism that opened and closed the caisson gates. Destroy it, and even if the Germans repaired the gates themselves, they wouldn't be able to operate them. Copeland had 12 men with him, each carrying between 30 and 60 pounds of explosives. They moved in practiced formation. 2 scouts ahead, main body following, rear guard watching behind. They encountered their first German resistance at the dockside, 3 soldiers in a sandbagged position, firing a machine gun down the dock. The solution was simple and brutal. 2 commandos with Tommy guns suppressed the position while another worked around to the side and dropped a grenade into the sandbag nest. The machine gun went silent. They reached the winding house at 1:42 a.m. The building was substantial. Thick walls, steel door, designed to withstand anything short of a direct hit from a large bomb. The door was locked. This didn't matter. Copeland's men placed shaped charges against the door hinges. 4 seconds after detonation, the door was in pieces and the commandos were inside. The interior was a marvel of mechanical engineering. Massive gears, steel cables thick as a man's arm, motors powerful enough to move the 1,500-ton caisson gates. It was about to become scrap metal. Demolition training emphasized speed and precision. You didn't place explosives randomly. You identified the critical structural points and placed charges exactly where they would do maximum damage. For a winding house, that meant the main gear assemblies and support pillars. Copeland's men worked with the efficiency of a factory assembly line. 2 men placed charges on the northern gear assembly, 2 more on the southern, 2 on each of the main support pillars. 1 man wired all the charges together on a single detonator. The final man, Sergeant John Haynes, armed the charges and set the timer. Elapsed time, 4 minutes. They evacuated the building and took cover. At 1:47 a.m., the charges detonated. The explosion was contained within the building's walls, but you could see the roof lift and settle as the blast wave expanded and collapsed. When the smoke cleared, the winding house was a gutted shell. Nothing inside was recognizable as machinery. Copeland reported to Newman via radio, southern winding house destroyed, moving to secondary objective. At the northern winding house, Captain Bob Montgomery's team was encountering problems. They reached the building at 1:43 a.m., but the approach was covered by a German bunker position that had survived Campbelltown's initial covering fire. Every attempt to reach the winding house drew immediate machine gun fire. Montgomery assessed the situation. His orders were clear. Destroy the northern winding house. His tactical situation was equally clear. Frontal assault would result in casualties his small team couldn't afford. He needed a different approach. Phillips, Taylor, with me. Everyone else, suppressing fire on that bunker. Make them keep their heads down. While his team poured fire at the bunker, Montgomery and 2 commandos worked around to the left, using a row of railway cars for cover. It took 3 agonizing minutes. 3 minutes during which German reinforcements could arrive, during which the situation could deteriorate, during which the mission could fail. They reached a position flanking the bunker at 1:49 a.m. Montgomery had a clear shot into the bunker's firing slit. He used it. 3 grenades thrown in quick succession. The machine gun went silent. The team rushed the winding house. Same procedure as Copeland's team. Shaped charges on the door, explosive charges on the machinery, timer set, evacuate. At 1:54 a.m., the northern winding house exploded, 2 for 2. The dock mechanism was destroyed. Meanwhile, at the pumping station, a massive structure housing the pumps that filled and drained the dock, Lieutenant Roderick's team faced an unexpected challenge. Intelligence had reported the pumping station would be lightly defended. Intelligence was wrong. The station was garrisoned by 20 German soldiers who had apparently decided that the thick walls made it an excellent defensive position. They weren't wrong. The building could have withstood a sustained assault by a company of infantry. Roderick had 7 men. Assaulting the building was suicidal, but the building had to be destroyed. Without the pumping station, the dock was useless even if everything else remained intact. He did what commandos were trained to do. He improvised. The pumping station had a large industrial door for bringing in equipment. The door was steel, but it was mounted on a track. It slid open rather than swinging on hinges. That meant the mounting mechanism was a potential weak point. "Anyone here a safecracker?" Roderick asked. One of his men, Private Charlie Lumley, pre-war career as a locksmith, volunteered. Lumley examined the door mechanism for 30 seconds. "I can blow the track. The door will fall inward." They placed charges on the door track and withdrew. At 1:58 a.m., the charges detonated. The door, no longer supported, fell into the building with a crash that probably registered on seismographs. The Germans inside responded with everything they had. Machine gun fire poured through the opening. Roderick's team couldn't get close. Solution: don't get close. Roderick had his men fire rifle grenades through the opening. They weren't aiming at the Germans, they were aiming at the pumps, the electrical systems, anything that looked vital. After 15 grenades, they heard the satisfying sound of something important breaking. Then Lumley had a better idea. "Sir, those pumps run on electricity, right? If we cut the power..." They found the external power supply 20 yards from the building. Cutting it was simple. Place explosive charges on the power lines, detonate, watch the lines fall. At 2:03 a.m., the pumping station went dark. Good enough. Even if the Germans retook the building, it would take days or weeks to restore power and repair the damage. Roderick reported success and moved to his secondary objective. Across the dock complex, similar scenes played out. Lieutenant Brett's team destroyed the inner caisson gate. Lieutenant Purden's team demolished the old entrance lock gates. Captain Hooper's team took down 3 dry dock bridges. Each team worked with the same methodical efficiency. Reach objective, place charges, blow it up, move on. The Germans, credit to them, recovered from the initial shock faster than British planners expected. By 2:00 a.m., organized resistance was forming. German troops from the barracks were reaching the dock area, establishing defensive positions, beginning to coordinate their response. This was the critical moment. The demolition work was proceeding on schedule, but the longer it took, the more German reinforcements would arrive. Newman's protection teams were holding defensive perimeters at key locations, but they were outnumbered and ammunition was finite. Newman himself established a command post near Campbelltown, trying to maintain coordination even as radio communication degraded. Some teams checked in regularly, others had lost their radios to enemy fire or equipment failure. He was conducting the operation partly through confirmed reports and partly through guesswork based on the sound of explosions. At 2:10 a.m., he received the report he'd been waiting for. All primary objectives confirmed destroyed. The Normandy dock was now a non-functional ruin. Even if the Germans cleared the wreckage of Campbelltown and repaired the caisson gates, the winding houses and pumping station would take months to rebuild. Mission accomplished. Now came the hard part. Survival. The extraction plan had always been the weakest part of Operation Chariot. Getting in required surprise, speed, and audacity. Getting out required all of that plus luck, which is another way of saying the extraction plan assumed things would go better than they probably would. The original plan called for the motor launches to evacuate Commandos from several locations around the harbor at 2:30 a.m. By then, the demolition teams would have completed their work, and the protection teams would have held off German reinforcements long enough for an organized withdrawal. That plan died in the Loire estuary when half the motor launches were destroyed or damaged before reaching the harbor. The survivors faced a choice between attempting the evacuation as planned or saving themselves while they still could. To their eternal credit, they attempted the evacuation. At 2:15 a.m., the surviving motor launches, 8 of the original 16, began maneuvering back into the harbor to collect troops. They were immediately engaged by every German gun that could reach them. The fire was even heavier than during the approach because the Germans had now identified the landing points and concentrated their weapons accordingly. ML-270, attempting to reach the Old Mole landing point, came under fire from 3 different directions. Her skipper, Lieutenant Erich Bert, held position even as shells walked across the water toward his vessel. Commandos sprinted along the dock toward the launch. 23 men reached her before a 75mm shell hit the launch amidships. The explosion destroyed the engine room and started fires throughout the vessel. Bert ordered everyone into the water. The launch was sinking, but they were still several hundred yards from open water. Men jumped overboard and started swimming, some of them wounded, all of them exhausted, none of them with any realistic hope of reaching safety by swimming. ML-160, commanded by Lieutenant Thomas Boyd, saw men in the water and made a decision that exemplified the courage of that night. He turned his launch back into the harbor, directly toward the German guns, to pick up survivors. His crew pulled 32 men from the water while under continuous fire. 2 of Boyd's crew were killed during the rescue. Boyd himself was wounded, but remained at the helm. When his launch could hold no more, Boyd turned for the estuary. ML-160 had taken over 60 hits. She was on fire in 3 places. Her steering was damaged, and her engines were failing. She made it 2 miles downriver before the engines quit entirely. Boyd and the survivors jury-rigged a sail from tarpaulins and drifted the rest of the way out to sea, where they were picked up by British destroyers at dawn. Boyd would receive the Victoria Cross for his actions that night. 32 men owed him their lives. At the Normandy dock, Newman realized that organized evacuation was impossible. Too few launches, too much enemy fire, too many commandos scattered across the dock complex. He made a decision that saved lives. He ordered all troops to make their way independently to the Old Mole, where launches would attempt pickup for another 15 minutes. After that, anyone remaining would attempt escape and evasion inland. This was essentially admitting that most of the force wouldn't get out by sea. But it gave them a chance, however slim, rather than having them defend untenable positions until ammunition ran out. The Commandos began fighting their way toward the Old Mole. This wasn't a withdrawal. It was a running battle through a dock complex filled with German troops who were increasingly organized and increasingly angry. Captain Roy's protection team held the dock side to cover the withdrawal. They established a defensive position using shipping containers for cover and fought off 3 German counterattacks. Ammunition became critical. The Commandos stripped weapons from German casualties, used captured grenades, rationed every bullet. At 2:25 a.m., Roy received Newman's order to withdraw. His team had been fighting for 50 minutes. They'd suffered 40% casualties. They'd held long enough for the demolition teams to complete their work and begin evacuation. They fell back in stages, rear guard providing covering fire while the main body moved, then the main body providing cover while the rear guard leapfrogged back. It was textbook infantry tactics executed under the worst possible conditions. They reached the old mole at 2:35 a.m. 2 motor launches were attempting to hold position while under fire. The launches could hold perhaps 60 men total. Roy had 32 men left from his original team. Dozens of other commandos were converging on the mole from other directions. The mathematics were brutal and obvious. Not everyone would fit. Roy organized the evacuation with remarkable calm. Wounded first, then demolition teams. They've completed their objectives. Then protection teams. If there's space, assault teams. Men loaded onto the launches while German fire intensified. A mortar round exploded on the mole, killing 3 commandos and wounding 5. A machine gun opened up from a warehouse window, forcing everyone to take cover. Private Jack Butler charged the warehouse alone, firing his Tommy gun from the hip. He killed the machine gun crew but was hit multiple times by return fire from other German positions. He died on the dock, buying time for others to board the launches. At 2:42 a.m., the launches were full. They pulled away from the dock while commandos on the mole provided covering fire. The launches cleared the immediate danger zone, then ran the gauntlet back down the estuary through the same fire that had nearly destroyed them on the way in. ML-306 took a direct hit from a 170-meter shell. The launch exploded and sank in seconds. Only 7 men survived. ML-443 made it to open water despite being on fire, her skipper unconscious and her steering destroyed. The crew navigated by steering with the engines until British destroyers found them at dawn. In the harbor, approximately 200 commandos remained, including Newman. They had accomplished their mission. They had destroyed the dock. They had no way out. At 3 a.m. on March 28, 1942, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Newman stood in what had been a German warehouse and assessed his situation with the clinical detachment of a man who had already accepted the inevitable. He had approximately 200 men under his command, scattered across the St. Nazaire dock complex. They held several strong positions but were surrounded by increasingly organized German forces. They had limited ammunition. Most had expended 60–70% of their load during the assault and firefight. They had no heavy weapons beyond a few captured German machine guns. They had no possibility of reinforcement or resupply. Their only advantage was that the Germans didn't know how many commandos remained or where they all were. Newman made a decision that military historians still debate. Rather than surrender immediately or attempt a suicidal breakout, he would fight a delaying action that would keep German forces occupied and away from Campbelltown. The destroyer sat in the dock gates, packed with explosives set to detonate at 9:30 a.m., 6 hours away. The longer the commandos held out, the more Germans would congregate around the dock when the explosives went off. This was psychological warfare taken to a grim extreme, using your own doomed force as bait to maximize enemy casualties from the trap you'd set. Newman organized his remaining men into 4 groups, each taking defensive positions in different parts of the dock area. The groups would fight independently, causing maximum confusion and forcing the Germans to commit forces to multiple locations. "Our job now," he told his officers, "is to make them think we're a larger force than we are, keep them occupied, and go down fighting. No one surrenders until they're completely out of ammunition or too wounded to fight. Clear?" The officers nodded. No one protested. They understood. From 3:00 a.m. to 6:30 a.m., the commandos conducted one of the most remarkable defensive actions of the war. They weren't defending a position. They were conducting a mobile defense, moving between buildings, setting ambushes, attacking isolated German units, then falling back before superior forces could pin them down. One group, led by Captain Hooper, held a warehouse complex for over an hour against repeated German assaults. They used captured German weapons, improvised booby traps, and intimate knowledge of the buildings they'd scouted during the assault. When they finally ran out of ammunition, they destroyed their remaining weapons and surrendered. Another group, under Captain Montgomery, fought a running battle through the submarine pens, the massive concrete structures that were supposed to be impregnable. They used the pen's own bulk against the defenders, setting up cross-fire positions that forced the Germans to advance carefully, buying time with every yard. At 5:30 a.m., with dawn approaching and ammunition almost exhausted, Newman gathered the remaining commandos, perhaps 60 men still capable of fighting, for one last action. They would assault the German headquarters building, not to capture it, but to create maximum chaos and draw every available German soldier away from Campbelltown. It was suicide, and everyone knew it. They attacked at 5:45 a.m. The assault lasted 12 minutes. They got within 50 yards of the headquarters before German reinforcements surrounded them from three sides. Newman, wounded in the leg and out of ammunition, finally ordered surrender. At 6:00 a.m., 169 commandos were prisoners. Another 34 lay dead or dying in the dock complex. Of the original 611 men who had set out from Falmouth, fewer than 230 had made it back to England aboard the surviving motor launches. The Germans, in those early morning hours, believed they had won. The British raid had been repulsed. Yes, there was damage to the dock facilities, but nothing that couldn't be repaired. The old destroyer wedged in the dock gates was being examined by engineers and naval officers who were curious about British shipbuilding techniques and wondering if the vessel could be salvaged. At 10:30 a.m., an hour later than planned due to a faulty fuse, HMS Campbelltown exploded. 4.5 tons of Amatol high explosive detonated in a confined space directly against the caisson gates. The explosion was heard in Nantes, 15 miles away. The blast wave shattered windows a mile from the dock. The caisson gates, each weighing 1,500 tons, were blown inward and collapsed into the dock. The forward section of Campbelltown disintegrated. The rear section broke apart and sank. And the German officers, engineers, and sailors who had been examining the ship, over 380 men, were killed instantly or died from injuries in the following hours. The Normandy dock was destroyed. Not damaged, not temporarily out of service. Destroyed. The Germans would not fully repair it until 1948. The immediate impact of the Nazaire raid was dramatic. The only dock on the Atlantic coast capable of servicing Tirpitz was gone. German naval planners suddenly faced a strategic problem with no good solution. Their most powerful battleship was effectively caged in Norwegian waters. But the true significance of the raid went beyond immediate tactical success. It created ripple effects that changed the strategic calculus of the entire Atlantic War across multiple dimensions. First, the operational impact on German naval strategy. Tirpitz remained in Norwegian waters for the rest of the war, conducting limited operations in the Arctic, but never attempting an Atlantic sortie. Without St. Nazaire as a safe repair facility, the risks were too high. If she was damaged, even moderately, she would need to make the 200-mile journey back to Germany, through waters where the Royal Navy could concentrate overwhelming force for an interception. This wasn't timidity, it was rational calculation. The Germans had learned from Bismarck's fate that damaged battleships were vulnerable, and Bismarck had been sunk trying to reach a French port for repairs. Without that option, attempting Atlantic operations was gambling the most expensive, most powerful ship in the German Navy against odds that kept getting worse. The British Admiralty estimated that caging Tirpitz freed up the equivalent of 2 battleships, a carrier, and numerous escorts from permanent Atlantic duty. Those ships could be redeployed to the Mediterranean, to the Pacific, to convoy escort duty. The strategic gain was immense. Second, the psychological impact on German coastal defense. Saint-Nazaire was supposed to be impregnable. It was the most heavily defended harbor in occupied Europe. If British commandos could destroy facilities there, nowhere was safe. After March 28th, the Germans significantly increased coastal defense forces all along the Atlantic and Channel coasts. These troops, an estimated 150,000 additional soldiers over the following year, were pulled from other theaters or from formations that could have been used on the Eastern Front. Those soldiers sat in bunkers watching empty seas while their comrades fought in Russia. That redistribution of forces was a direct result of Saint-Nazaire. Third, the commando mystique. The raid demonstrated that British forces were capable of spectacular offensive operations even when the strategic situation was defensive. Coming at a time when Britain had suffered nothing but defeats, Singapore fallen, Tobruk lost, the Atlantic convoys being savaged by U-boats, Saint-Nazaire proved that British forces could still strike back effectively. The propaganda value was enormous. British morale, which had been declining through early 1942, recovered significantly. The Germans were forced to admit that a small British force had penetrated their Atlantic wall and destroyed major installations. The raid featured prominently in British newsreels and newspapers for weeks. More importantly for military culture, Saint-Nazaire established the template for modern special operations. The raid demonstrated that small, highly trained forces conducting precisely planned operations could achieve strategic objectives that would be impossible for conventional forces. This lesson would be applied throughout the war and would influence special operations doctrine for decades. Fourth, the impact on German U-boat operations. Saint-Nazaire wasn't just about the Normandy dock. The submarine pens and support facilities took significant damage during the raid. While the pens themselves were too massive to destroy with the explosives available, the supporting infrastructure, fuel storage, repair facilities, power systems suffered extensive damage. U-boat operations from Saint-Nazaire were disrupted for 3 months. Submarines had to operate from other ports or make do with reduced maintenance capabilities. This degradation in U-boat effectiveness, though temporary, came at a critical time in the Battle of the Atlantic when every advantage mattered. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly in the long term, the raid validated the concept of combined operations. The cooperation between the Royal Navy and the Commandos at Saint-Nazaire was unprecedented. Naval officers and army officers planned the operation together, trained together, and executed it together. This was revolutionary for 1942, when inter-service rivalry was still common and coordination was often poor. The success of Saint-Nazaire led directly to expanded combined operations funding and authority. Mountbatten's organization grew from a small planning staff to a major force that would eventually coordinate D-Day. The lessons learned at Saint-Nazaire about naval ground force coordination, about timing and precision, about the importance of training and rehearsal, were applied to every subsequent amphibious operation of the war. The strategic earthquake extended to how both sides viewed coastal defense and amphibious operations. The Germans fortified obsessively, convinced that the British would attempt more raids. The British, emboldened by success, did exactly that. Dieppe, later Normandy. The cycle of raid and counter-raid shaped the war in Western Europe. So why has Operation Chariot faded from popular memory despite its strategic importance and tactical brilliance? Why do people know about D-Day and Market Garden and Midway, but not about 600 men who changed the course of the Atlantic War? Several factors explain this unfortunate obscurity. First, the complexity of the strategic context makes the raid difficult to explain quickly. You can summarize D-Day in one sentence: the Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe. Saint-Nazaire requires explaining the threat of Tirpitz, the importance of the Normandy dock, the Battle of the Atlantic, and the strategic implications of capital ships, all before you get to the actual raid. In an era of decreasing attention spans and simplified historical narratives, Saint-Nazaire loses out to more straightforward stories. Second, The raid wasn't the final decisive moment in the Atlantic War. It was an important component of eventual Allied victory, but U-boats continued sinking ships. The Battle of the Atlantic continued for years, and Tirpitz, though caged, remained a threat until finally sunk by RAF bombers in November 1944. Saint Nazaire was crucial but not conclusive, and human memory tends to favor conclusive moments. Third, geography and cultural distance. For American audiences, who dominate English-language popular history, the raid occurred in France, involved primarily British forces, and affected a strategic situation, the Atlantic convoy system, that was critical to Britain but less visceral than, say, Pearl Harbor or the Pacific Island campaigns. American involvement in the raid was limited to the destroyer Campbelltown, originally an American ship. This geographic and cultural distance means American historians and filmmakers have largely overlooked the raid. Fourth, the operation was overshadowed by later, larger amphibious operations. Dieppe came 4 months later, a disaster that killed or captured over 3,300 men, but involved more troops and received more publicity. Then came North Africa, then Sicily, then Italy, then Normandy. Each successive operation was larger, involved more forces, and ultimately seemed more important. Saint Nazaire became a footnote to these better-known operations. Fifth, the human element. The most famous figures of World War II, Eisenhower, Patton, Montgomery, Rommel, weren't at Saint Nazaire. The raid was led by relatively junior officers who, despite their skill and courage, never became household names. Ryder and Newman both survived the war, both received Victoria Crosses, both had distinguished post-war careers. Neither became famous outside military circles. Without famous personalities attached to it, the raid struggled to maintain public attention. Sixth, changing scales of warfare. By 1944-45, military operations routinely involved hundreds of thousands of troops, thousands of aircraft, massive naval fleets. Against that scale, a raid by 600 men seemed small, almost quaint. Modern audiences, conditioned by films depicting massive battles, find it difficult to grasp how such a small operation could have strategic significance. Seventh, the uncomfortable casualty ratio. Of 611 men who participated in the raid, 169 were killed, and another 215 were captured. That's a 62% casualty rate, catastrophic by conventional standards, though acceptable for commandos conducting a one-way mission. But publicizing operations with such casualties has always been sensitive. During the war, emphasizing losses risked damaging morale. After the war, the high casualty rate made Saint Nazaire less attractive as a feel-good story compared to operations with better survival rates. Despite these factors limiting popular memory, military historians have never forgotten Saint Nazaire. Professional military education still studies the raid as a textbook example of special operations planning and execution. The British military honors the raid annually. Veterans organizations maintain the memory, and the evidence of impact remains undeniable. Tirpitz never entered the Atlantic. The convoy system survived. Britain held on until American entry into the war shifted the strategic balance. These facts, while not solely attributable to Saint Nazaire, were significantly enabled by the destruction of the Normandy dock. The men who fought at Saint Nazaire understood this. In post-war interviews, they consistently emphasized not their personal heroism, but the strategic necessity of the mission. They volunteered for what they knew might be a suicide mission because the alternative, allowing Tirpitz to hunt convoys unopposed, was unacceptable. Lieutenant Colonel Newman, in a 1980 interview, put it succinctly, "We were given an impossible mission that needed to be done anyway. So we figured out how to make it less impossible and went ahead. That's not heroism, that's just problem-solving under pressure." Captain Ryder was similarly modest. The Royal Navy's job is to control the seas. Sometimes that requires sailing into battle. Sometimes it requires ramming destroyers into dock gates. You do what's needed. Their modesty, characteristic of their generation, unfortunately contributed to the operation's obscurity. They didn't promote themselves, didn't write best-selling memoirs, didn't campaign for recognition. They simply did the job, survived or didn't, and moved on with their lives. Before concluding, we must acknowledge what gets lost in strategic analysis and operational details. The human cost of Saint Nazaire. 169 men died during the raid or immediately afterward. Each represented a person, someone's son, brother, husband, father. The strategic necessity of the operation doesn't diminish that loss. The success of the mission doesn't console the families who received telegrams informing them of death or capture. The 215 men captured faced years in prisoner of war camps. Some endured brutal treatment. Several died in captivity from wounds sustained during the raid. They sacrificed years of their lives, years they could never reclaim, for a mission that worked exactly as planned, but offered them nothing except captivity as reward. The survivors, those who made it back to England, carried psychological scars that 1940s military culture had no vocabulary to describe. Today we call it PTSD. In 1942 they were expected to get over it and return to duty. Many did, some couldn't. The long-term cost of combat stress was paid decades after the raid, in nightmares and flashbacks and relationships strained by experiences that couldn't be explained to people who hadn't been there. We must also acknowledge the German casualties, over 400 killed when Campbelltown exploded, many of them technical specialists and experienced sailors whose deaths weakened German naval capabilities for months. They were equally courageous, equally devoted to their nation, equally human. The strategic necessity from the British perspective doesn't erase the tragedy from the German perspective. War is fundamentally about forcing your opponent to accept an outcome they would otherwise reject, and that forcing requires violence, destruction, and death. Saint Nazaire exemplified this with particular clarity. The raid worked precisely because it killed people and destroyed things. Modern sensibilities often struggle with this. We want war stories with clean victories and minimal moral complexity. Saint Nazaire offers neither. It was necessary, brilliantly executed, strategically crucial, and morally uncomfortable all at once. The men who conducted it were heroes who volunteered for a mission that killed and captured 62% of the force. Success came at costs that we can calculate but never fully comprehend. The only honest way to remember Saint Nazaire is to hold all of these truths simultaneously: strategic necessity and human tragedy, brilliant execution and terrible cost, military triumph and personal sacrifice. In the end, Operation Chariot deserves to be remembered not merely as a daring raid, but as a case study in how seemingly impossible missions become possible through planning, training, courage, and acceptance of risk that conventional military thinking would reject. Remember the strategic context: a single dock that enabled the most dangerous battleship in the Atlantic theater, and no conventional means to destroy it. Bombing failed. Naval bombardment was impossible. Submarine attack was impractical. Every option had been tried or evaluated and found wanting. Remember the solution: load a destroyer with explosives, recruit 600 volunteers, train them obsessively, then sail directly into the most heavily defended harbor in occupied Europe, and trust that surprise, skill, and audacity would compensate for overwhelming enemy superiority. Remember the execution: 18 minutes from first contact to ramming the dock gates, during which HMS Campbelltown endured fire from dozens of German weapons and still hit her target at exactly the right spot, at exactly the right time. Then, the demolition ballet. 12 teams destroying 12 objectives in under 30 minutes, working with the precision of neurosurgeons while under fire from an increasingly organized defense. Remember the cost: 169 dead, 215 captured, families notified, lives ended or forever changed. The raid worked, but success was purchased with blood and years of captivity and psychological wounds that never fully healed. Remember the impact: Tirpitz caged for the rest of the war. Convoy routes secured. The Battle of the Atlantic influenced but not determined by this single action, yet influenced significantly enough that historians still debate how much longer the battle would have lasted if St. Nazaire had failed. Remember that this matters because at critical moments in history, individual actions and small unit operations can have disproportionate strategic effects. 600 men changed the course of the Atlantic War. Not through grand strategy or overwhelming force, but through precise application of force at a critical vulnerability. This is our history, and it's worth remembering. Not because war is glorious, it isn't. Not because sacrifice is romantic, it's tragic. But because sometimes understanding how ordinary people accomplished extraordinary things by accepting extraordinary risks helps us understand what humans are capable of when stakes are highest and options are limited. On March 28, 1942, at 1:35 a.m., HMS Campbelltown struck the Normandy dock caisson gates at 22 knots. The collision changed naval warfare, changed German strategic planning, changed the trajectory of the Atlantic War, and it was accomplished by men who volunteered knowing they probably wouldn't come home. That's the story of St. Nazaire. That's why it matters. That's why, despite fading from popular memory, military professionals still study it, historians still write about it, and the handful of surviving veterans still gather annually to remember comrades who didn't return. The raid worked. The dock was destroyed. Tirpitz was caged. Britain survived. That's success measured in strategic terms. But success measured in human terms requires acknowledging that 169 men died to achieve it, that 215 more spent years in captivity, that families were shattered, that psychological wounds were inflicted that never fully healed. Both measurements are true. Both demand remembrance. The strategic triumph and the human cost are inseparable parts of the same story, and we diminish both if we remember only one. So remember St. Nazaire. Remember the desperate strategic calculation that led to its planning. Remember the volunteers who knew the odds and went anyway. Remember the 18 minutes of hell that delivered them to their target. Remember the demolition teams working with surgical precision amid chaos. Remember the failed extraction and the long captivity that followed. Remember that sometimes at critical moments, individual actions matter enormously, and that 600 men proved it on a single night in March 1942 when they sailed into the teeth of German defenses and destroyed the one facility that made the Atlantic's greatest threat truly dangerous. This is our history. This is what ordinary people did when the world was burning and alternatives had run out. This is how desperate strategic situations sometimes require desperate tactical solutions, and how those solutions sometimes work exactly as planned, despite odds that should have made success impossible. The Normandy dock remained unusable until 1948. HMS Campbelltown rests there still, her bow section still embedded in what remained of the caisson gates after the explosion. Tirpitz never entered the Atlantic. The convoy system survived. Britain endured, and 169 men never came home. Remember them. Remember what they did. Remember why it mattered. Remember that this happened, that it was necessary, that it worked, and that it cost more than strategy can measure or statistics can capture. This was St. Nazaire. This is our history, and it's worth remembering.